Yo, welcome back to Christ First Podcast, and we are here today again, and we are going to talk about Jacob wrestling God. So, with Jacob wrestling God, right? This is it's a very interesting but yet deep story, and with context, which hopefully, Spirit leading me right now, I can be able to bring that context and make this make sense. So, we're going to start in Genesis 25, verse 23, right? And this is after Isaac and Rebekah are together. And the Lord said to her, Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples will be separated from your body, and one people shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. Now, God is already saying right here, which the countless times I read past this, I never noticed this, but God is literally saying how Jacob's already going to have the blessing, right? And it goes to a saying to show in this story of Jacob, it really reveals a lack of trust that Jacob and Rebecca, or not Rebecca, I'm sorry, Jacob and Rachel have. Oh no, I'm sorry, Jacob and Rebecca. Yeah, a lack of trust that Jacob and Rebecca had in God, right? And it shows how just somebody said, I'm gonna go to it right now. It was I was looking it up because I was trying to find more information about it, but they basically said that the story of Jacob is all about a guy who doesn't believe he's going to get God's blessing. So he spends his life hurting everyone around him. He tries to scheme and steal the blessing and abundance for himself instead of trusting God that he's going to give it to him. And what's funny is when I read that, I was like, everything made sense. Like just the entire story of Jacob. And this is where we're going to start at. When Jacob came out of since birth, he's been trying to get that blessing, but it's already been promised, right? But he's been trying to get that since birth. And for example, he came out, grabbed Esau's heel, right? Because he wanted to get that birthright. Then Esau came to him, and he literally like blackmailed his brother, or I don't know if it's called black. I'm pretty sure it's blackmailing, but his brother was hungry, and he said, "I'll give it to you if you basically give me your birthright." Esau sold his birthright over just because he was hungry, right? And this is how bad he wanted this blessing when Jacob didn't realize it was coming to him. You see how he's still struggling to trust? So then you go and you end up finding out that he deceives his own dad. Isaac was blind and they deceived him. Isaac was blind, man. Like his wife was in on it too. Rebecca and Jacob come up with this plan to deceive Isaac to give the blessing that Esau was supposed to have, but to give it to Jacob instead, right? And they deceived the blind man into giving that up, and the pain and hurt that Isaac felt for being played like that, and he knew no better. An innocent man being played like that because of two people's lack of trust. I'm not saying this to bring them down because we're no better, but still, it just shows how human ways tend to get in the way of what God's trying to do. Human will gets in the way of what God's trying to do. All right, so look how many people he's hurt. His family's broken. His family's literally broken now because of how much he's wanted this blessing. His family is broken. Then you have the second aspect where he goes to Laban because he had to flee. So you never hear Rebecca again or Isaac. Like that's it. So he flees, and then when he flees from his family, he goes and he meets this girl Rachel. He likes Rachel and he wants to get Rachel, so he tells Laban, "Let me work, and I'll work for her." Blah blah. He said 7 years and you can get her. Well, Laban lied to him, and eventually after 7 years, he made him marry Leah because they said that usually the oldest are the ones that get married first. And in that time, the oldest got everything first, like the blessings, marriage, whatever. They were given into everything first. This is the reason why what God said required trust, because he said the younger will serve, or I'm sorry, the older will serve the younger. And this is what shows how God was requiring them to trust him. Even though man was saying it's supposed to be this way, God was saying, I'm going to do it this way. And they had to trust that, right? So he gets there. And what's funny is him getting there, then he gets played, marries Leah, and then he has to work another 7 years just to really keep, what's her name, Rachel. And it's funny because now Leah's hurt because the man that she's with isn't paying attention to her. He's paying attention to her sister. So, you know how that feels for her. And either way, he ends up getting 4 wives, 12 children, and the blessing that God had for him being a nation, was happening, but it wasn't in the way that God wanted it to be. And the thing about it was Jacob did all these sins, hurt all these people, and God was still going to give him the blessing. But throughout that way, because Jacob wasn't waiting and trusting that God was going to bring it, he ended up hurting other people in the way of that, in the way of getting what he wanted, right? So then you come to when he's wrestling God, and this is what's so beautiful when it comes to wrestling God. See, when he came to God, you end up figuring out what he was wrestling God for was something he would have already had if he just waited, right? And he had to get to that wrestle. He had to wrestle God because, in that moment, his entire will, everything was trying to do everything that God said was going to happen, but he was trying to do it for himself. In that moment, he had that lack of trust because he's wrestling with God for something that was on the way. And it also shows in our life how we do the same thing. See, what Joseph, not Joseph, what's his name? Jacob was missing was the fact that, again, God said this was going to happen, yet he went out his way to do it himself. In the process, hurting other people, leaving other people broken, leaving other people, just with other issues. And it's funny how God got him alone for him to wrestle. It was through, Jacob's fear of Esau because he was going to have to face Esau again. Esau was coming with men, armies, all of that. So Jacob prayed that God would save him. And then he goes again and does something out of his own will, but he goes and he brings all these gifts in front of him and sends all of his people ahead of him, ahead of Jacob, to Esau, and was telling Esau, your younger brother, your servant, when first off, that wasn't true. Esau was supposed to be serving his brother. But anyways, he was saying all this stuff to butter him up basically before he met him. When he got alone, that's when the man or Jesus came or God came to him. And that's that moment when he wrestled with God. And in that moment, he was saying to let go. It was almost sundown. And Jacob said, I won't let go until you bless me. And that's when God blessed him after that moment because he knew he was wrestling with God, right? It was somebody more powerful. It's a powerful entity that was down there wrestling with him. And he knew that had to be God. And that showed faith. But we got to look at the fact that he had to wrestle because of what he did. That was his entire lifestyle. That was a symbolization for his lifestyle, wrestling with God to trust something that was coming, right? And see, it can correlate into our own lives for a reason because there are many things that God wants us, that God has for us. And with those things, we have to trust that God is going to bring them. We have to trust that God's going to bring it when he does. And we have to trust that if he said it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Not go out of our way and hurt other people just to get what he said was going to come. And that's that wrestle with God that we must do. And it shows. And what's funny is now God invites people to wrestle with him because of this other will that we have, this free will in our flesh, it always naturally makes us want to go against what God's trying to tell us to do. It makes us, or not makes us, but it wants us to do what God is saying, like the opposite of it. And because of that, this is why God invites us to wrestle with him, because it brings clarity. It brings wisdom. It brings, blessings as well, because you stay in that, even though you may not understand it, you stay in it in faith, knowing I'm here with God right now, and I don't understand it, but I know he'll help me understand it. You got to think about people who leave the faith. They have questions that are unanswered, and instead of just waiting for God to answer them, they leave because they don't have the answer. Then they go bashing on God because he didn't answer their question, but they didn't stay in the fight, right? Like, think about it in a relationship with, your spouse or with your girlfriend or boyfriend. Like, you literally have to stay in those moments where it gets heated, where it's like, I don't understand what's going on. Like, you have to stay in it. When you quit, you just hurt it. You hurt the other person, when you quit on them. And the thing about it is you can't just quit it and then go to somebody else. I mean, you're just doing the same thing. So that's why God invites us to wrestle, and him wrestling, it represents that. It represents that, that, what's the word? It represents that faith that we need to have, knowing that we can get in that tough moment with God. We can suffer with God. And this is when God changed his name to Israel, because then he says, you have struggled with God and you are now Israel, right? And what's funny is he says you struggle with God, and that's all God invites us to. Through that wrestling, we also struggle with him. And, we're struggling with God, we end up actually growing. And, a perfect, analogy, not even analogy, a perfect symbolization of this was Jesus, because he struggled with God. Although he was down there professing his name and living with him, he struggled with God. And this is where I want to get deeper into. I hope I'm still making sense, but this is where I want to get deeper into. Him wrestling, Jacob wrestling with God also is almost like it resembles Jesus' life as well. Because after Jacob wrestles with God, God gives him a new name. And that new name means he becomes a new person. Because back then your name meant everything. So if your name changed, you're somebody new. and God changed his name. His name was Israel after that day. And what's funny is in Jacob, when his name was Jacob, he made those mistakes. He sinned and hurt other people. When he became Israel, he became something new, and that's when he became that nation that God was promising him to do. But he had to change his name for that. But it all works together. But the point is, it's also the same with Jesus, because he wrestled with God for man, right? Because man was wrong, but see, he came in place of man's wrong to basically justify them in front of God, and that means he would have to wrestle with God ultimately, struggle with God, and he ended up winning. And that win, we get to win with him as well, even though it was God himself. The correlation that is being made here is that Jesus wrestled with God for us, and he won. Right? God let him win. He won, just like how God let Jacob win. Jesus won, and he won, and now we can win with him. We don't have to stay under the wrath of God, because see, we now struggle with him. We will now win with him. And Jesus going on the cross is also like when Jacob's hip got dislocated. It was wounding the pride, right? His flesh, Jesus' flesh literally died there. And see, when God wounded Jacob, it's like he wounded his pride as well. So it's just funny, because the Bible is a book that has like so many connections and things in it, and it's almost crazy how it just comes together, how every part of it comes together. But the main point, if what I said was a bit too much to get, or wasn't making sense, the main thing that I hope did make sense is the fact that Jacob didn't wait. Jacob didn't trust God, and his struggle to trust God is what caused that wrestle match to happen. He was struggling to trust God, so he kept believing the way that God was telling him to go, just to get something that God was going to ultimately lead him to, right? Instead of for trying to just trust in the fact that God was going to bring it, even though Esau was getting the blessings in front of him, Jacob was going to get the ultimate blessing, because his older brother was going to have to end up serving him, right? I mean, you could think of it like this way too. What Jacob did was so messed up. He had to flee from home. And who knows, maybe he would have, let's say if he actually obeyed God and trusted him, he probably would have met Rachel at the correct time, at the right time, to the point where he wouldn't have to get played and get with her sister first and, then marry her. Because who knows, if he came later, his older sister would have been married already, and that way it would have been just simple to get with Rebecca. And then, boom, they could have had Joseph and the rest of them, because Joseph came from Rebecca anyways, because that was Rachel, because that was the woman that he chose. He wanted Rachel. And it just shows how much man causes the Lord's plans to have to not change, but just mess it up. You know what I mean? Because we have that free will. And because of, Jacob's free will, people got hurt in the process. And for another example, Abraham, because of his free will and his wife telling him, hey, you should go sleep with Hagar so we can have this son that God's talking about. It's another time where our flesh is trying to become God and do things, ahead of his time, do things out of what he said, out of order. And it's funny, because you realize that was another woman that got in between God's word, right? Because God told Rebecca that she had two nations in her. The older was going to serve the younger, yet she still doesn't trust him and goes and deceives her own husband, who was blind. Eve gave the fruit over to Adam. Sarah, she's the one that told Abraham to go sleep with Hagar, right? And this stuff is like an endless cycle, right? And it's almost like, I'm not about to get into that, because that's like a whole another thing. But the main thing to get is the fact to trust God. You know what I mean? Jacob showed a lack of trust with God, and he ended up hurting people because of that, instead of for just trusting him. So trust him and understand that sometimes you're going to have to wrestle with God anyways. You're going to have to. Every Christian has to wrestle with God. There's certain areas in our life where we don't understand what he's doing. And he's inviting you to come in that misunderstanding, in that lostness, to come to him so you can find the truth. Because that's how we come to God anyways in the first place, because we don't know what's going on. And it's like, hey, God, I don't know what's going on, but I need to come to you. I got to surrender. And, that's how it is. And once we surrender, God lets us win. We win with him. You know what I'm saying? Like, because of Jesus, he lets us win. We were supposed to lose, but God let us win. He let mankind win because of Jesus, because of what Jesus did.